So a few weeks ago, the lead singer for the Christian rock band Hawk Nelson declared to his fans that he no longer believes in God. Well, this came as a pretty big shock because that band had sang about God for so long. And because they sang truths about God, they taught their fans theology. And so now all of a sudden, their fan base, which is primarily young Christians, are seeing one of their Christian celebrities say, all these things that I sang about for years, I no longer believe. And so I imagine there are many who are trying to process through that and say, what do I do when a Christian celebrity decides that they no longer believe the things that they promoted from a public platform for so many years. And so I think as a church, it's important to talk about these things, especially as our young people are trying to navigate these things that are important to them in culture. And this is how he starts off his post. He said, "I'm not looking for debate at all, just a chance to share my story in hopes that some good can come from it." I'm not sure what good he hopes to come from this. His primary audience were religious young kids, and he's now saying those things that I sang about, I no longer believe. And so I think it's important for us to address some of his issues and say, okay, if he chose to make his personal journey public, then let's publicly talk about some of his journey, because he's not the only one walking through these things. And so I think the questions and concerns he has and experiences that he has are actually fairly similar to many of the experiences that young Christians are probably experiencing today. And so here's a few thoughts on the lead singer of Hawk Nelson no longer believing in God. Number one, we should not make idols out of celebrities. This seems obvious, but we all do it. And inevitably, if we set somebody up on a pedestal and have expectations of them to be perfect, they're never going to be able to live up to that. And eventually, they will fall. And when they fall, it's going to be devastating for us too, because of how much investment we put in those people. We need to be careful not to raise anybody except Jesus up on a pedestal. You know, singers are not always good theologians. Sometimes they are, but not always. But they are far more influential than theologians. And that's part of the danger of making Christian celebrities, especially musicians, into the primary teachers of our theology. And so, again, we shouldn't raise people up on pedestals where they shouldn't be, because they may or may not have good things to say, but we need to be careful about the influence that we allow people in our culture to have over us. Number two, our opinions don't determine what is true. And so he is offering his opinion. He's saying, my conclusion based on my experiences is that God does not exist. Well, that may or may not be true. That is his conclusion, but our opinions don't determine the truth. Our opinions can recognize the truth. And so I hope that even though this is where he is in his journey, I hope this will not be the end of the journey for other people who say, well, if he says God doesn't exist, God must not exist. I hope this is the beginning of a journey where they say, well, if he's got some questions and some doubts, maybe I need to start thinking through things and address those things in my own life to determine what is true, not based on someone else's opinion, but based on objectively, is this thing true or not? Number three, our beliefs are primarily based on emotion, not reason. Even the most rational among us build our beliefs primarily on our emotions. And then we bring reason into the picture to try and justify the things that we already are believing based on emotions. And psychologists have found this over and over again, that emotion is what drives our beliefs. And so this is why many of the issues that he brings up are emotional issues rather than intellectual issues. He's not bringing up issues like, how do I understand the Trinity? How can God be three in one? How do I understand how Jesus can be fully man and fully God at the same time? How could God create everything out of nothing? He's not bringing up those sorts of things. He's bringing up things like, how could a loving God allow evil? How could a loving God send people to hell? How could the God of grace in the New Testament be the same God that seems so angry and wrathful in the Old Testament? These are great questions and should be addressed. But one thing first is oftentimes when we go into a question, we start by saying something like this. And this is what he says. If God can do anything, ... And we say, if God can do anything, then why would he do this or that? Well, I don't think that's a great way to start, because I don't think we always know what we even mean by that. We just assume that if God can do anything, then why did he do the thing that he did? And I think a good question for us to ask ourselves anytime we come up against these issues is this: what would you rather God have done? Or maybe, what should God have done that is different than what he did? Because if we're going to accuse God of what he did do, it's probably good to have an answer for what should he have done instead. If we assume that he made the wrong choice, then we're assuming that there was a better choice available to him. And what is that choice? And we can't just gloss over it by saying, if God can do anything. Can God do anything? Can God cease to exist? Can God lie? Bible tells us that God cannot tell a lie. Can God do logically contradictory things like create a square circle or a married bachelor? We ask these questions of God and assume that he can just do anything. And that just gives a free pass to he should have done something different than what he did. Well, let's look at some of those issues real quickly. The issue of hell, of course, is one that people have talked about and debated for a long time. What would you rather God do? What should God do with a guy like Hitler? Let's take an extreme example. What should he do with a guy like Hitler? After everything Hitler did, he commits suicide in his bunker, and then he goes on to paradise and heaven? Well, that doesn't seem fair. He ceases to exist. Well, so he gets away with it, is what we're saying. What should happen to Hitler? Should he face justice? And we start to realize that we don't even think that way in our own culture, right? We see people commit evil, and we say we can't ignore that. There needs to be some sort of justice against evil. What about the issue of Old Testament violence? We see Old Testament violence and say, wow, how could God promote or allow a lot of this violence in the Old Testament? Well, there's a lot to say about that, but one thing that's important to keep in mind is that this was not a problem for the people in the Old Testament the way it's a problem for us. And this is what I mean by that. To us, we believe in the 21st century that we are somehow superior and not violent, although there's many, many examples that we could point to that show the contrary. And we assume that, wow, these people in the Old Testament, they would have been bothered by this the same way we are. But the fact is they knew that they lived in a violent world. All the cultures were violent. They were warring against each other. They were fighting for territory. The way the Israelites treated those that they defeated in battle was far more merciful than how they would be treated had those nations defeated them. You read about nations like the Assyrians and the sort of tortures that they committed to their prisoners of war, and you realize this was a violent world. And people understood fundamentally in that world that sometimes you're the victor and sometimes you are defeated. And one way or another, you got to navigate through this violent world. And so God enters into the violent world, obviously progressing people further from that. And that goes into his issue with how does the God of the Old Testament line up with the God of the New Testament? God of the Old Testament seems so angry and wrathful and violent. And God of the New Testament's all about grace and love. Well, the God of the New Testament is just as opposed to sin as the God of the Old Testament. The difference is that his wrath and judgment against sin fell on the person of Jesus instead of us. And so Jesus willingly takes our place so that the wrath of God against sin falls on him. And so sin is still dealt with. Wrath is still put towards sin. Sin is still judged, but it's put on Jesus rather than us so that we don't have to face the consequences of our own sin. And so I would say that you can't even understand the grace of the New Testament without looking at the judgment and the wrath in the Old Testament. They go together, and one actually makes more sense of the other rather than being contradictory. There's other issues that he brings up that would take longer to get into, but you start to see that many of the things that he takes issue with have been addressed by smart Christian thinkers for generation after generation. Nothing that he brings up is new. There's no new objection to Christianity under the sun 2,000 years into this thing. And so all it takes is a little research, a little digging, and you can find great answers to all the things that he brings up. Number 4. He experienced some shallow experiences in church during his teenage years. And you know what? If we give our young people gimmicks and games at church and that's it, nothing deeper, then we shouldn't be surprised that they outgrow those things as they get older. Because that's exactly what you do, right? Adults outgrow childish things. And if all we give our young people in our church are childish things and gimmicks to try and trick them into being in church, that's how he felt. He felt like there wasn't something right about all of this stuff. He felt like it was just cheesy or it was just gimmicky. And he rightfully didn't want anything to do with that when he got older. And so we need to give our young people substance, something real to hold on to, rather than just trying to trick them into staying into our churches, because that won't work. Number 5, the church must teach apologetics to our kids. We can't fear the hard questions. Let's tackle them. Let's do our homework so that we have answers to give our young people when they bring up these tough questions. Because the truth is if they don't find an answer at church, they'll find it somewhere else. They're not just going to let the question go. And so it's also okay for us to admit when we don't have an answer and to say, that's a great question. Let's go find an answer together, because sometimes it's not even about finding the answer. It's about the journey addressing the question. And I hope that young people in our church will feel like their questions are welcomed and that this is a safe place for them to think through it and to discover who God is and what he has said in his word. And I hope that we will be there side by side with them to go on that journey. And the last thing I would say, number 6, is this. Ultimately, our kids need a personal experience with God that is theirs. They can't live on the coattails of their parents' faith. They can't just see the faith of their parents and just live on their experiences. They need to have experiences themselves. Because I think if they experience the goodness of God in their own life, that they may have the same reaction that Peter has in John 6, where he says to Jesus, Lord, to whom else shall we go? You have the words of eternal life, and we have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God. He's saying, God, there's nothing else out there that I would rather experience than the eternal life that I experience walking with you. You have the words of eternal life. When I walk with you, life is far richer and more meaningful, and I'm connected to my Creator in a way that nothing else in this world can satisfy. And so where else would I go? I pray that that's how our young people would see us living our faith, so that they might say, whatever it is that they believe, I want that in my life. How can I experience the same God that I see my parents and my mentors and the other adults in our church sing about, pray to, talk about? So share the stories. Help them to experience God for themselves, and God himself will draw them and keep them close, even when those doubts and those questions pop up in their minds. And so Canvas Church, remember, God is there, and he loves you, and your church family loves you too. So we'll see you again soon.